the final major barrier is systemic issues. What I mean here is that I see mental health as a complex system with many different inputs. Some of them are contextual, things that are happening in the world around us. Some of them are historic. Some of them are what we're doing in our own mind and body, how we're relating to our experience, our relationships, biophysiology, different factors within this complex system. This is how Stephen Hayes is sort of viewing mental health more in his process-based therapy approaches that are developing, that you just see these very complex systems, and it's about identifying, what can change in the system, what are the easier parts, and how we can do that. And kind of drawing it out can be a useful task with yourself, actually, to map out your OCD system and what are the different inputs that you feel might be within it, from history, from the obsessions you're experiencing, from the compulsions and different emotions that might be there, and core fears, unworkable beliefs, historical factors, unworkable problematic coping strategies, things like that. So you can map out all of this sort of stuff and look at it. And what I would say is that it can be very hard to work on OCD and exposure work if there's a lot of instability in this system around you. It's not impossible, but often it's good to try and stabilize that system and tackle the bits we can. For example, a very simple one would be if we're a shift worker and we are having very disorganized sleep because of that, and that's an input into the OCD system, it might be harder to make progress whilst we are having, massive impact on sleep. Our brain's not able to consolidate the learning. It's elevating stress hormones, things like that, making it harder to work on it. Again, not impossible. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of changing jobs and things like that. But just as an example, where a biophysiological input could have a big stress on the system. And I think, to really identify what these systemic issues are, and really looking at the current situation, what are the stresses outside of OCD for me? And just let me say up front, for some people, OCD is seemingly quite simple, and it seems to be more about the internal mechanisms and probably some epigenetic vulnerability to it. And actually, a lot of things are good in people's lives. I've worked with people like this where relationships are good, job is good, there's no overtly problematic stuff, they don't have a massive trauma history, or even a particularly difficult history, but yet the OCD is there in the system, and it's more about probably the inner mechanisms and what we're doing. But I would say my experience is that's what's one category of people. Actually, a lot of people, there is more things feeding into the system. I'd say my own personal clinical experiences is more likely there are contextual factors, historical factors, and other things in the mix here. So we want to identify those and work on those with ACT and compassion skills as well. So systemic things could be things like working in problematic environments where we are overworked or underworked, and it's a very stressful situation. We might be in relationships that are problematic. They might be a small amount of problems, i.e., someone is a bit hard on us, a little bit dismissive, or not, is neglecting our emotional needs. They may be not affectionate and loving, but generally it's on the milder end, right through to more toxic relationships, narcissistic partners, abusive partners, emotionally abuse, physical abuse, these different patterns. So people can be in those sorts of relationships, and it's obviously highly stressful, and it's evoking lots of different emotions, and certain emotions are suppressed, and that can all interact in the OCD system, be a stressor. I don't think, I'm not someone who feels that OCD is always symbolic of a unexpressed emotion, or historical difficulty, or a relationship issue. But I think those things can be stresses that feed into the OCD system and can exacerbate symptoms, and are worth tackling, both for helping our OCD recovery and just making our life happier and more meaningful. Um, we can be experiencing, marginalization, things like racism, homophobia, um, poverty, systemic sort of issues like that. Obviously, in our current world, there's a lot of that going on. And these are incredibly stressful things. If you look at the research on these different ways that people get marginalized and oppressed, I mean, it's kind of obvious. It's incredibly stressful. And then can be more historical things. So it could be bigger, more what would be called big T trauma, so more obvious, overt trauma where we felt our life was in danger and we didn't have the capacity to escape or cope with it particularly easily. We weren't supported through it, or we didn't get to safety quickly. Um, and we're maybe more vulnerable to trauma as well. Or we could have small t traumas, more, emotional neglect, abandonment. I think I won't go into trauma in too much detail, but often in the OCD world, people like to differentiate that OCD and trauma are not, it's not that one causes the other. And I certainly agree with that. I certainly think, I've worked with many, many people that have no obvious trauma and have had pretty good attachment, good life experiences. But there definitely is a significant number of people that trauma is in the mix, and different levels. And of course, trauma can impact us differently depending on our vulnerabilities. I think if you've hung around and spent time with young kids, you've been a parent or a sibling, or you've got kids in your family system, you can see that temperament is so different immediately. Some kids immediately can just smack their head, watch a scary thing on TV, um, get ill, get an illness, and there's just no reaction. They're just very equanimous the whole way through, and it's pretty easy. Whereas other kids, like the smallest knock on the head, illness, hunger, um, they watch a tiny bit of Jeopardy on TV or something like that, and it's incredibly overwhelming. And so there's just this baseline level of what our nervous system's like, what our beliefs are like how safe we believe we are, all this sort of thing, that feed into, what is traumatic for people. And so, what one thing that's not traumatic for one person, because they have that kind of resilient, innate disposition, might be very traumatic for someone else. And I would certainly put myself in the category of children that would be very more sensitive to pain and distress and things. Um, so yeah, that can be part of the system, and then you need to work that through with a therapist who knows how to work on trauma as well. And really, I could list a lot of different things that fit that go into this system. I mean, biophysiology is another. If we're not taking care of our body, we're eating the wrong things. There might be drug addictions, other alcohol addictions, things in the mix, or we're not exercising, we're very sedentary, or things that raise inflammation in the body are going to impact on our mental health. And so we want to work with a therapist to identify, are there any of these things in the mix? Hopefully in an assessment, people will get to the bottom of this. We want to be very honest, and then we want to start using our values-based problem solving and action planning skills from ACT to see, are there ways to, in a very focused way, problem solve our situation. And there are videos on this channel about problem solving and action planning, and tying that to values and compassion, how we give them a compassion and values focus. So I won't go into that too much, but really listing the options, doing some pros and cons analysis, choosing the best option, you might do that a number of times and then building up an action plan, and then trying to take action. So it's very different to rumination. The problem with all of these systemic issues is they're very difficult, but we may be also ruminating and getting stuck in our mind on them as well, and amplifying and making them more difficult. And everyone does this, we all do it. But the more we can diffuse that and get into problem solving, the better. And sometimes they're not easy problems to solve. It's not an obvious choice, especially if we have OCD and getting caught in uncertainty or perfectionism. It might be very hard. We might need external perspective therapists to help us with that. We may well need allies and support, to either access the people who are supportive and compassionate in our life, or to go out there and meet new people, get charities involved, mental health charities, other places that could help us problem solve and do what we can. And sometimes it's longer term work, and we've got to just work on a small step at a time. And we have to tolerate something for a certain period until our housing gets moved or our job can change or whatever it might be. So sometimes we have to just keep going, focus, small step at a time, use our skills to do that, and know that things will change in the long run, and then we will look back on it differently. And then sometimes things can't change because of the way the system is and the life we have, and misfortune and inequality and other difficulties. And in which case, um, self-compassion is a huge thing, finding allies and support where we can, but also at least being compassionate to ourselves and being that inner ally and extending continuous compassionate self-talk. And so sometimes these systemic issues, we have to tackle them first and then stabilize and then go on to the OCD work. Sometimes you can work on both at the same time using the same skills if they're not so problematic, and we might move back and forth between them. If they're very problematic and imminently, sort of either incredibly stressful or even putting us at risk, then of course we have to work with the systems around us, with a therapist, with other organizations that can support us to make changes. And I obviously can't advise on that or get into that too much because it's very specific, and you would need to work with a therapist or with an organization to help you with that side of things. But if it's more on the milder end of the scale, then you can work on that by problem solving and social support and using the ACT skills and compassion skills as you move through those difficulties and try to improve your life in a values-based direction. Often we have to tackle this stuff. Often it is a huge stressor that is exacerbating our symptoms, making it much harder to work on recovery. So get some help, get some support if you need to, and take good care of yourself.